It is so exciting to see everybody from all around the world come and join us today. So thank you so much, Toddle, for inviting me to share a little bit more about assessment and what this looks like in the early years. As you've heard a little bit about me and my role, I'm an enrichment and environment coordinator in Austin, Texas, with over a decade of experience in the IB as a coordinator and former classroom teacher in the IB. And so I know where it is that you guys are coming from. And I love that part of my job is that I get to support educators like you around the globe and in my current school. What has been so fantastic with my experience with inquiry is that it's led to some of the work that is coming out in May, like you've already heard. I've written a book with Elevate Books called Leading with a Lens of Inquiry, Cultivating Conditions for Curiosity and Empowering Agency. And it's really focused on how we all need to be leading with this lens of inquiry from the classroom teacher all the way up to our heads of schools and superintendents, so that we can really nurture schools of inquiry for ourselves and for our students. And if we know that inquiry is best for our students, then we know that it is best for us as adult learners as well. So I'm very excited to be able to celebrate so many amazing educators and teachers and leaders who I've been so very fortunate to learn from and learn with. So hopefully this time next month, you'll be able to purchase that on Amazon. But in the meantime, if you're not already following me on social media, I do a ton of sharing on Instagram. One of my core values is connection. And I feel like this is a great way for us to connect and grow our PLN. I love to lift up misconceptions and questions from you guys and from my teachers who are my learners. And what does this look like in practice? So if you are not there or you have not said hello, I definitely encourage you to go on and start following me over there. And the hashtag as well, Leading with Inquiry, is one that I utilize and share a lot of different things, what's happening in our classroom. So with that said, hopefully beyond today, I know that I see some of you trickling in who I've seen on Instagram before, but if you are not there, hopefully we continue the conversation after today. So with that said, let's start to tune in. You're going to hear me say a lot of different language from the inquiry cycle. I really love to be super intentional with that for you as adult learners, because I know that it's really important for us to utilize the language that we should be utilizing with our students. So we're going to stop and pause and reflect and tune in a little bit with something called intentions. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this or have this as part of your practice, but this is something that I do with all of my learners, both my student learners and my adult learners, because it really has an opportunity for us to stop and pause in the moment. And we know that as inquiry practitioners, really being in the moment with our learners and really listening and watching and looking and seeing what's unfolding right in front of us is a mindfulness practice. And whether you have a formal mindfulness practice or this is something that's a little bit newer to you, I love to start all of my sessions with an opportunity for us to stop and pause and then tune in and reflect and consider what brought you here today. On the screen, you'll see a couple of different intentions that I was using to design the session for us today. We're going to be engaging in a playful mindset. We know with our early learners that play is so important, and really talking about and understanding the power of thinking routines inside of our classrooms. We're going to be evaluating these as a form of assessment and how we can consider these as a way for us to monitor and measure and document and report on the learning and really value the process over the end product as it relates to learning inside of our classrooms. And then, of course, as with anything, because reflection really is at the heart of learning, I'll be asking you to stop and pause at several different portions of the session today. I've broken it down into 3 sessions for you, but I will be, like I just said, stopping to pause to let you jot down your thinking, share some of your ideas in the chat. Obviously, your questions are invited there as well, but giving you that space on this day to be able to kind of really just what initial ideas or feelings are kind of coming up for you. So with that said, I'm going to stop and pause and give you a moment to consider what's an intention that you want to set for yourself today. You all jumped up on here on your day off from work. So what brought you here? Perhaps it's a word or a phrase or some sort of feeling that you wanted to get from this time that we have together, however many of the sessions you end up engaging in today. Perhaps there's a word within the intentions that I have created for you that you want to pick up and lift up for yourself. But whatever it is, whatever it comes from, I'm going to ask you to jot down an intention. I see some people are already using the chat. Thank you so much. What's your intention today? I'll share mine as you're kind of getting used to this, is to empower you and to connect with you. Those are my two intentions. So of course, the session is designed with these in mind, but those are mine today. And I'm super curious to see where those intentions and those words take me with you today, and also how they show up in the rest of my day today. I love that intentions have an opportunity for us to really tune into what it is that we need. And they're not evaluative like a goal, but really bring us back into the moment. So I'll give you a few quiet moments to do that now.
I see a lot of people talking about creating authentic assessments, learning more about assessment tools, exploring strategies for different dimensions of assessments in the PYP.
Excellent.
Thank you so much for sharing.
Okay. Yes. And again, I know I won't be in all the other sessions, but I'm super curious if you can return to this intention later, and how does that show up in your way that you are listening and leaning in and asking questions throughout the day. So super curious about that one. All right, like I said, I've broken down our session into 3 different subsections. So when we consider and we think about how we can assess our littlest learners, one of my very favorite things that I do with a lot of schools and teachers, both at my current school and different schools and teachers around the world, is I really spend a lot of time talking about the power of provocations and how provocations can really be used to support our next steps. Now, whether you've had a lot of experience in the IB or not, I love to unpack a little bit about what provocations are, or the purpose of a provocation. That we design provocations with the end in mind, right? That there's that backwards planning. And I love to ask my learners, what is it that you want your learners to feel, to think, to be, to do as you're considering the provocations that you're designing? It's not just another learning experience that we're asking our learners to be able to participate in, but we're really setting the tone and the stage of how we want our learners to engage with the learning with us. Provocations, of course, can launch a unit, but also, and I'll show you with this next example, provocations are not necessarily limited only to the start of the unit. I'd love to nudge your thinking here and to consider how provocations are also a tool for us to assess our learners and measure and document where it is that they are in their thinking. So, of course, with inquiry, we want our students to do the heavy lifting. You see some evidence here, and actually one of my pre-K classrooms from just this past week, they were doing a research project on animals. And so you can see the graphic organizer of their thinking of all of the different research they came up with. There's a honeybee, I think, in there. I think there's some insects in there. And so the teacher had used a simple graphic organizer for the students to be able to document their thinking. And then what I really loved was how she considered this as an opportunity to nudge and provoke her thinkers, her learners, someplace else. So it could be, or traditionally, that the students had their research, they shared about it, and then that was that, and the unit was over. But I loved how the teacher considered this as an additional invitation or provocation for her to nudge her students thinking in a different direction. After the students had completed their graphic organizer, you'll see a bunch of dots that are across all of the different worksheets. Those were evidence of conversations that the teacher was guiding after they were sharing. She was using the different color codes to put dots around the connections that the students were making. Now, we know with our littlest learners that their attention span is not necessarily the same as perhaps our 10-year-olds. And that's totally okay, right? That's developmentally appropriate. So she left those dots there for herself as an evidence of their thinking and the learning. And then what I love that she did was she took all of their graphic organizers and she took a big piece of butcher paper, she glued them or taped them all down, and then she used string to make the connections. Now, her learners were not there, right? Her learners had gone home. After they went home, she sat and she sorted where it was that their students were making the connections. She put attached string to it, so that way there was that visual representation. And then here's what I love that she did, and here's how she used it, not only as a form of assessment to document the learning and report on the learning, but also as a provocation. She prominently displayed this at her front board. So as the students were coming in, lo and behold, they see this amazing celebration of all of the research. But what was happening was her students were super curious to begin to see where their student thinking, or where their classmates thinking rather, were making connections. They went up to the board, they were touching and moving their fingers and having this amazing conversation the next day about their research, about the connections that they had made, when we know that if we probably were to ask these students, tell me about your research or what you did yesterday, they might be like, I don't know, I couldn't remember. So she was so mindful and so intentional about using this evidence of learning, again, as a provocation, letting her students do the heavy lifting. All she had to merely do was organize it in a way that she knew that her learners could access it, to be able to go back to it. As her learners were stepping forward and looking at the evidence of their learning, she was standing next to them, of course, asking them some additional questions to provoke some conversations, to give them some language. This was actually in one of our pre-K classrooms. And so in this pre-K classroom, the students are learning English as a second language. So it was really important for them to continue to build up this communication skill, and for her to be able to scaffold that, I thought was such a beautiful example of how she could provoke their thinking towards that. And she didn't have to do all the work. The work was already done for her by her students. She just had to display it or present it in an inviting way. All right. As it relates to provocations, I love to be able to consider how we use provocations to leave space for wonder. And what do I mean by that? Thinking routines, of course, as you read the session description for this morning, is a really great opportunity for us to provide equitable space for all of our learners to be able to share their thinking. And it really invites an opportunity for them to ask questions, to be able to be engaged, and again, lets them do the heavy lifting. So the first one that I want to show you is a tug of war. Now, with this one, the teacher was able to lift up a common misconception, again, provoking thinking, but also assessing where her students were. So she came up with this, she wrote down the sentence stem, or the sentence rather, everyone can get what they need from the earth. She knows from her experience and really knowing her curriculum and knowing her students that this probably would be a common misconception. But she's not going to just assume. She needs to gather the evidence, right? That's what assessment is. We're gathering the evidence over time to assess where our learners are and where it is that we need to step in. So provoking their thinking, she put up this sentence. And then again, with this tug of war thinking routine, I don't know how many of you participated in this before, but this is something super easy and tangible. She had the students share their thinking regarding or related to this statement. And then she jotted those down word by word and then left their statements there as they were. And then those were her next steps, but it was again, her provocation that was assessing where the student thinking was. Now she's done this routine probably, I'd say, over 5 years, and each and every time, although there are some common ideas that students share that she can anticipate, where it is that the students are always surprises her and is always a really great opportunity for us to co-construct next steps with our learners ever so mindfully. One of the other things that I want you to notice here as well is next to, on the blue, she has yes and she has no, and she had some numbers. So, right, so she was tallying and asking her students where it is that you agree or disagree or where your thinking is. She initially had that number on either side. And then as the sharing was happening with her students and as the conversation was unfolding, she crossed it out and used a different color to be able to show that their thinking was already starting to shift and change. Again, she's modeling this reflective process and she's assessing now where her learners are going. Just in this one conversation, she already has a documentation of how her learners' thinking is changing a little bit over time, just in a 20-minute provocation with her students. So Tug of War is a great opportunity to do that. It is not a lot of prep work. It's a handful of statements. A lot of the times these misconceptions can just come from your district's curriculum or your units of inquiry, of course, as you look at the reflections from your students later. Are there misconceptions that bubbled up that you can use as your frame for this thinking routine? That would be a great place to start. Now, I'm going to return to this thinking routine a little bit later as we unpack something else as it relates to assessment. So keep this in mind. And there's one more thing that I want to show you with this one. All right. See, wonder, and know. So this probably is a thinking routine that if I had this room of you physically, we would all have our hands up. We know, see, think, wonder. But what I love about this thinking routine, see, wonder, know, is we've shifted the value and the importance of the question, right? As we are assessing for learning, we are also assessing our students' questions, because questions are truly a form of assessment. Yes, questions have a way for us to drive our next steps. But I'd also love to nudge your thinking in that they are also a form of assessment. So as I was working with this teacher here and we were designing a provocation for her unit of inquiry, I asked her to shift where she had her wonder or her questions column towards the middle. And highlighting or showing that she really values questions. We have been really intentional on our campus to show that we value questioning and the process of learning versus that end product. So what are the different ways and the mindful ways that we continuously do that to show our learners that we value curiosity, and it's not necessarily all the things that we know. So you can see here that the teacher was documenting the students sharing. They are not writing. This is actually another pre-K class as well. So she's documenting the questions as they're coming. She's obviously using their names. So there's that true ownership too in regards to what's important and how you're helping us co-construct the learning with one another. In that center column with wonder, again, are all the student questions as they are asked and as they are written. And I'd love for you to really look in at the middle of that wonder column. Ms. Hoffhines, I don't know if she's here this morning, but she puts herself there too. And I know she does that ever so intentionally because she wants to model for her learners that she is curious, that she wonders, that she wants to know more as well. And I love that she doesn't start with her question first. I love that she allows the other students to be able to share first, and then ever so intentionally and mindfully, then she's asking her question in there. And so this is another opportunity to provoke more questions from her learners. Now, I was not in this session when she was engaging with her students in this opportunity, but if you see your students questioning perhaps dip a little bit, although we know our kids have a million questions, if we're providing an opportunity for some really thought-provoking things to explore with one another, or their provocations are really connected to the learning. But if you see student questions kind of stall out a little bit, this is a great opportunity for you to insert yourself and model for yourself and for your students what type of thinking you want to nudge them towards. So thank you, Ms. Hoffhines, for letting me come into your classroom and be able to grab this evidence of learning. She still has this up in her classroom, and it's something that her students, it's actually low enough for her students to be able to tangibly go and touch and look at and feel. And I feel like that is something that is super powerful as well in regards to helping students feel a part of the learning. All right, here's where we stop and pause, and I give you some time to sort. I've listed a couple of questions here, but what I'm going to ask you to do now is, whether you're taking notes on an iPad or you have an inquiry journal right in front of you, or wherever it is that you're documenting your thinking today, perhaps these questions can nudge or help you create some evidence of your learning. So I'm going to stop and pause and be quiet. If you want to jot down some of your thinking of some different ways that you can reconsider your role, perhaps your thinking about provocations has started to shift. Perhaps there is some common misconceptions that I've shared for you that you want to jot down or share for the group. I'll invite you to do that now as you are sorting and making meaning of provocations as an invitation for us to assess our learners. Kirsty is asking about provocations in the middle of the unit. So I'll speak to that now. And I do have some time for questions at the very end, but provocations in the middle of the unit, all that means is we're trying to provoke and nudge our learners thinking in a different space. So that see, wonder, know thinking routine was actually not done at the very beginning of the unit. It was done a little bit further in relation to the concepts that they were exploring. So I think that I constantly ask my teachers, what type of thinking do you want your students to be engaged in? Where is it that you want to nudge them? And then that's an opportunity for us to design a provocation or another learning experience for them in that way. I love all the conversation in the chat. So great.
Yes, I've been loving it as well. It's so great to see the community helping each other identify more provocations. And we do have a few reflections coming in, but please keep sharing it. Reflect on your own as well if you need to. You don't have to put it on chat, but we'd love to see your reflections come in.
Yes. Okay. Sorry, I went backwards. So I'm going to keep moving as you guys are jotting things up. Oh no. Okay. All right. So this is the meaning making part. I went a little too fast and I don't want to click on my screen to go and miss out on this slide. So meaning making, how do we help our students make meaning? Where can we allow opportunities for our students to sort, right? Just as I did for you there, I've designed a couple of questions to give you some space and time to sort. So question sorts is where we're headed next. Now, I love question sorts because again, we are building cultures that value thinking, and with thinking comes sorting, right? We know as adult learners, we need to do this to make connections, to make meaning. And so we need to be really intentional with how we do this for our students as well in our classroom. We want to emphasize what's important. So again, I'll go back to questions and curiosity. We know that questions and curiosity are important in inquiry because we know that it holds personal meaning and value for our learners. And we want our students to do the work in the co-constructing, so that way the meaning is worthwhile to them. So question sorts are a fantastic way to do this. And this, again, was in a pre-K classroom. And although the question formulation technique is a little bit more of an advanced questioning protocol and way to build that capacity with our students, it doesn't mean that our littlest learners and that you as early years educators cannot provide opportunities for students to be ready for that when they get to that stage, right? So a question sort is a really great way to do that. And while I was working with this teacher, I was talking about the QFT and she's like, I don't think my students could do this part of it yet. I said, great. Could they actually sort questions? And she said, what, this seems like a great opportunity for us to assess what is a question and what is a statement, right? These are part of her standards. It's part of her curriculum. Students need to know the difference between those types of sentences. So in this unit, she was having the students, and then this again was later on in the unit, she was capturing questions later on after the students had gathered their research, had engaged in some conversations and reflections with one another. So this is a provocation to invite and extend and nudge their thinking a little bit longer. So she created the categories for them. Again, we know that grouping and sorting is part of our curriculum standards for our littlest learners. They need to know how to put things in groups when it relates to maths, or when we're talking about categories and sorting in science. It's some of our science standards. So she came up with the categories for them. You can see those right here. What does it look like? What does it live? And there was one other category. And then she had the students generate questions. Now, of course, some of her students were not generating a question, but they generated a statement. Again, this was an opportunity for her to monitor and measure where her students' thinking was at in relation to those type of statements. So if a student said, for example, it lives under the water, she could use as an opportunity to have her students reflect and consider whether or not that statement was a statement or was it a question. So it was a great in the moment teaching opportunity about statements and sentences versus questions. They transformed those statements into questions, and then she had the students sort them into different groups. And when we were reflecting on this activity, I said, were the students able to do it on their own? And she said, yes. And I said, what makes you say that? How do you think they were able to get there? And she said, well, this was not the very first time that I allowed them to have space to sort their ideas and to sort their thinking. And so we just sat there and we brainstormed and we documented were all the other ways that she has provided her students opportunities to sort. The next question that I asked her as we were reflecting, I said, could your students do this when they first walked into your classroom doors in August? We start school here in August in Austin, Texas. And she said, yes, completely. Obviously, it would be a little bit more guided, but what an amazing thing for her to reflect and empower herself, but also empower her learners the first day that they're walking in with sorting and categorizing questions and lifting up the questions from the learners themselves to guide her next steps. And her teaching. She didn't have to do it. All she had to do was utilize a structure. And again, that's the power of these thinking routines for her students to do the heavy lifting as she's facilitating and guiding the learning along the way. Let's see here. Anything else for question sorts? Oh, yes. One more thing before we move on. I know that a common misconception that I get in regards to question sorts is, what if my kids aren't asking good questions, right? This is, some of you are nodding your heads. Yes. Well, my kids are not asking good questions. Well, then I'm going to actually nudge you back to consider, how are you developing the skill within your students? Just like any other skill that we're teaching with reading fluency or math skills, those are particular skills that we know that we are providing opportunities for direct instruction and modeling and teaching. So if your students are not asking good questions, then what opportunities can you provide for them to be able to know what a good question is, what qualifies as a question, just as this teacher did here? And again, questions are going to change over time. I actually just posted on my Instagram a series of questions from the beginning of the year, middle of the year, and end of the year with some of our students on our campus to show that just like any skill, we know that it's a skill that we need to be actively considering and developing over time. And then also considering where it is that we want our students to go in regards to the skill of questioning. So this was a beautiful example of that. And I really loved, yes, thick and thin questions. Thank you for lifting that up. There's definitely power in that. Do our littlest learners necessarily need to know the thick and thin questions yet? Perhaps not. But is that a skill that we want to be able to scaffold towards for maybe our grade ones? Yes, of course. It is the collective efforts of everyone inside of our learning community that gets our students to be able to do the things that we want them to do within their learning within our classrooms. All right, scaffolding thinking. I've already alluded to this a little bit, but this was something that was an amazing evidence of learning in actually one of my kindergarten classes. We were talking about how we can scaffold thinking routines over time as educators, and as we're reflecting and planning our units of inquiry, how can we be really mindful of that? Now, sometimes with thinking routines, I get a lot of questions from teachers saying, my kids can't do that. This part is too hard. This is too complex. And so I'll nudge back again and I'll say, okay, but what can they do? Where are they at? Just because they can't do this thinking routine entirely doesn't mean we squash the whole idea, but we can stop and pause and step back and consider what part of it is that we can do. So parts, purposes, and complexities is definitely a little bit more of it's a systems thinking routine. It is something I would say I've seen in pre-K all the way to my 5th grade team. So I would definitely not rule this out for our littlest learners. But where I'd love to nudge your thinking here is, what part of a thinking routine are your students ready to tackle? So in this kindergarten classroom, they were exploring force and motion. And they were looking at kites. It is springtime here in Austin. And so the weather is prime. We're also looking at weather prime for kite flying. So what she had the students do was take apart a kite, and she created a graphic organizer for them. And with their small groups and pairs, they were doing the very first part of this thinking routine together collaboratively with their thinking partner. What are the parts of this kite? She allowed them to take it apart, look at it, make their own inferences. Obviously, she was walking around and thinking about what kind of language were the students using. She was monitoring the conversations that were happening, perhaps the misconceptions that were coming up for her students as they were sharing. She was doing this actually in a small group. Thinking routines, I'm just answering one of the questions, can be used in multiple ways. I'm sharing how she's done this in a couple different parts. So this one was with the students' thinking partners who they have worked with a lot over the years, over the school year rather. And they were documenting it on this graphic organizer that you'll see right here. What are the parts? She didn't step in and tell them, no, that was not right. She answered their questions with another question. She loved the thinking. She used the thinking routine. What makes you say that? To nudge their thinking a little bit farther. That is my favorite question by any of them all. I know there's so many of them from Mark and Ron, but that one I just love because the access to that is so great and so easy and there's no prep. So the students were documenting their thinking. They brought these graphic organizers together as a whole group, and they were sharing and discussing some of their ideas that they had talked about with their partners. So the next part of this routine is purposes. So this is not necessarily some schema that her students had or some background knowledge. So as they were sharing out the things on their graphic organizer, she was then able to do a little bit of direct teach and model with this next part, which was the purpose. What would be the purpose of the tail? What would be the purpose of this wire stick? What would be the other purpose of this actual like kite structure? So she was able to have some guided conversations next, and documented the unfolding of learning on an anchor chart so that way they could use it later. She didn't do the last part of this thinking routine, complexities, and that's okay. Give yourself permission to not do all of it. As teachers, we always tend to think that we need to do all the things, but we don't need to do all the things. We can do just some of them or a smaller part of them, and really stop and go slower with our learners and show them that we value, again, that process over that end product. And not feel that weight for ourselves that we tend to always do. So I just loved how she was able to be a little bit more playful with her ideas and thinking, and not limit herself from engaging in this type of a thinking routine with her learners. So just kind of nudging your thinking in that way as it relates to thinking routines. All right. We're going to stop and pause again as you guys are sorting. And I've listed a few other questions for you. Some of these I've utilized in the sharing today, but as you're jotting down some of your thinking, what kinds of thinking do you want your students to engage in? I've shared the kinds of thinking that my teachers wanted their students to engage in. So that helped them design what kind of structure that they wanted to begin with and how they were going to scaffold that throughout the year. And again, the intentionality in regards to how we're allowing students to make meaning. And the beauty with thinking routines is it helps us stop and pause as adults from saying and doing all the things. We know we have the greatest intention to be able to provide that teaching moment, that powerful teaching moment for our students, but what opportunities are we taking away from our students when we do that? So I'm going to be quiet now as you are using the chat to share your thinking and jotting that down inside of your notebook. Some of you are making some amazing connections to the approaches to learning. Excellent. And be intentional with your students. Today, we're going to be using our communication skills as we utilize these thinking routines, right? Utilizing that language is so important for our learners to be able to hear us saying it. Okay. The complexities portion. Yes, complexities are what are the different ways that we can use these parts. Another way that I've seen that complexities column or the complexities part of this thinking routine is actually wonders or questions. Now, what questions or wonders do you have? Yeah. And all of that can be found on Project Zero's website. They have an amazing resource catalog for everybody to be able to dig into some of the thinking routines. I've also actually, now that you were asking the question about parts, purposes, and complexities, I had a teacher do that for, as she was setting up expectations to move around the school, right? Like standing in a line is like a thing, a skill we have to teach as we were walking with our students. So she used that thinking routine to help them like make sense of what does it mean to stand in a line behind my friend, and why would I do that? What would be the purpose of us standing behind somebody else? And of course, with our learners being being virtual for so many years, being out in the real world and interacting with one another is a real skill that we are all relearning. So I thought that was a beautiful way for her to make that connection. All right, last, but of course not least, reflection. Probably one of my favorite words. Of course, it is very synonymous with inquiry. But what stories do our walls tell? You know, I've talked about the monitoring, the measuring, the documenting, and the reporting of the learning because it highlights the process over the product. And learning walls are a fantastic way that we do that. It's my favorite. I talk about this a lot on my Instagram. So if you're like, learning walls, what does this look like? Go on over there, and I have a lot of different resources and different ideas for you. All right, so a learning wall. This is actually a first grade classroom, some students that were engaging in some reflection at the end of their learning. What this teacher had done was she invited her learners to go back and reflect on the rich artifacts of learning that happened over time. So she carved out some intentional space for them to work collaboratively, again, with their peers, being able to have them work on their communication skills, and to celebrate the learning. She gave them some sentence stems, and learning walls have a really great way for us to make the learning visible, but also keep the learning visible. Again, if we're talking about the importance of process over product, right? We're moving away from that that summative assessment and formative assessment, and we're looking at this process over product. It's really important for us to keep that learning visible for our learners so that they can make some meaningful connections. What I love about learning walls is that they're open-ended, just like a thinking routine. And our learners begin to make connections on their own. Now, that very first image that I showed you, the teacher was making the connections along with her students, right? So that was something that was a little bit more structured or a little bit more guided. This was super open-ended. The guided portion that the teacher did with this was that she gave some sentence stems to help them have some conversations with one another. So they were modeling, or they were practicing the things that they wanted to say about their learning as they were reflecting. And then later, after they had worked with their peers, she had them go on Seesaw. They took a photo of the learning wall, and then they just used that voiceover feature that's on there, and they were circling portions of their learning wall and talking about the learning and reflecting on the things that they learned. What did I used to think? Now what do I think? What was their favorite part? What connections could they made? Again, she was using some sentence stems and frames to be able to support that conversation. I use sentence stems all the time with adult learners. We need them too, and so do our students. So really leaning into sentence stems is a great way for us to model the types of thinking that we want our students to engage in. What does it mean to reflect, right? We're really allowing our students to flex the different approaches to learning, right? Those thinking skills, those communication skills, and say that again to your learners. Today, we're going to practice some communication skills and really dig into our thinking. And here's how we're going to do that. Lift that up for our learners. Don't let that conversation and that language only live behind closed doors when your learners are at recess or someplace else. Lift that up. Use that language with them. It's really important for them to be able to utilize that as well. Okay. Learning walls are definitely something that I love to use. And part of that are a couple of different artifacts that I'm going to lift up again for you. So here's that tug of war that I showed you at the very beginning, right? So she left this up inside of her room as evidence of learning, again, monitoring and helping that guide her next steps. But then what I loved that she did was the sticky notes that were at the bottom. Those came later, and those are questions. So she was using this thinking routine that she had as a provocation again later to provoke her students' thinking, but in the way of questions. So she wanted to have her students reflect on their learning in the form of questions. And again, I'm going to say it again, that questions are a form of assessment. She brought these questions to my office as we were reflecting together in the planner, and we were reflecting on the unit as a whole. Okay, now what do your students think? Now what do your students know? And so those were evidence of where her students' thinking had changed over time, and the evidence of learning. And she was able to use that as a way for them to reflect and think about their thinking and think about how their thinking had changed. You know, it's really important for us to be able to keep the thinking visible for our students so that they have some place to go back and Velcro their ideas and Velcro their thinking, and even realize that their thinking has changed over time. How many of us, when we are reflecting at the end of a term or at the end of the year, show our students, here's where you started at the beginning of the year with your reading and what words you could read. Now, where are you? And what an amazing celebration. So how can thinking routines really be an opportunity for us to celebrate and reflect with our learners? This one is fantastic, and I loved that. This is another graphic organizer that one of my teachers just created on her own as she was having her students reflect on their learning at the end of the unit. And I'm sharing this for something else, and I'll get to that in a moment. So she took the students' questions that bubbled up throughout the unit, and then she sorted them by the key concepts. Again, she's trying to help them build up their conceptual knowledge and understanding. So the students helped her sort. She probably had to do a lot of the modeling and scaffolding. This was actually a first grade classroom. And then they were reflecting on, okay, where do we find the answers to these things over time? And she organized that information in this resources. How did we find the answer, right? Research skills, we know, is one of the ATLs that we need to be building within our students. So how do we do that in a way that makes sense to our learners, in a way that makes sense to us? And it's not just us telling, right? We're co-constructing this with our learners so that way they feel connected to it. So she has all of the different things that they used as resources in order to find the answers to their questions. They use this as a reflection tool to celebrate again how they learned, what did they learn? And then what I love is that even though this unit was over, and I want to say, let me see what the questions are. This was the unit for where we are in place and time, if I'm not mistaken, because it was about migration. She left this up all year long, and this became an anchor chart for her learners. So when they were doing independent research, or some of her learners were doing some Genius Hour or some more independent research, it was just a simple nudge like, oh, where do you think you can find that answer? Is there something that we've used before? So her learners went back up to her wall, her learning wall, and they were able to use this as something later. So it was something that was co-constructed with her learners. They were reflecting together, and then it was used throughout the rest of the year as an anchor for her learners to be able to be independent researchers. So again, something so simple. Yes, the KWHL for sure. I do love that, although sometimes the complexity of that I find for the littlest learners is a little too much, but of course, every learner is different, every classroom is different. And again, just like I've mentioned here today, just because it's really complex doesn't mean we shouldn't. So perhaps, something to kind of consider. So this was fantastic evidence of learning that the teacher kept on her learning wall as well. All right, we're going to have you do a little bit more stop and pause and have you sort. I see a lot of sorting happening in the chat as well. I want you to consider, how do you currently support reflective thinking for your learners? What are the ways that you do that? Jot that down now. Maybe you don't. Maybe that's where you need some additional support. What opportunities do you provide your students to retrieve the things that they know? And how do you consider artifacts of learning for your learners that help you assess where they are, but also help them assess as well? Thank you, Anna. And yes, there needs to be an adult present. Yes, I know we can't always do it on our own, and that's okay. And so that learning wall with the students that were standing there, the adult was actually just right outside the photo. So she was there. Yep, Claudia, great idea. Add some photos. Excellent. Amazing reflections. Great. Oops, Sorry, move through these really quickly. All right, before we get to questions, I'm going to leave you with a provocation. We often think that we need this picture perfect map to get started, right? Our units of inquiry have the planners have so many parts to them and they feel really complex and it can be really overwhelming. So we think we need to do all the things, right? Just as this map on the left-hand side illustrates. But what we actually just need is one general direction to help guide us where our next steps could be. And although having a big picture plan and that map is really important, it can also feel really overwhelming and stifling for us as educators. And we miss the mark when it comes to assessment because we get overwhelmed with all those things. So what's a general direction that you can take for and with your learners that allows you to monitor and measure and document and report on the learning? And visible thinking routines and making the learning visible is a way to do that. And it's a playful way because it comes from our learners and we do it with them. I do this with my adult learners in my office and I document the learning with them. I literally just start with our school's vision statement, and as the learning unfolds, I am documenting and monitoring and measuring where it is that we're going. So I invite you to do the same with your learners, whether you choose a new thinking routine or perhaps you use a learning wall, the same that I kind of keep nudging you towards. Whatever it is, you just need a general direction and an intention to be able to really lean in and listen to guide your learners.